What's up, guys? Welcome to Design Over Time. This is a daily video log series where I talk about game design and other design topics that pop up in my everyday life. I'm your host, Kirby Kid, or Richard Terrell, and today I really wanted to talk about something that I think is absolutely important. This is absolutely key for just about everything we're doing on this channel, everything we're doing in design oriented, and what I argue is this is super important for anyone who wants to express themselves about video games. I'll just show you right off the bat. I mean, you can see it right here on the HUD, on the UI. This colorful wheel that I've been using in a few other design over time videos and a few other design oriented articles, but I reference it often, and I'll show you a little bit of it working right now. So yeah, this is the wheel, and it's quite colorful. You can see that it has a lot of little segments to it, a lot of pieces. Don't get overwhelmed right now. We'll go over it in a few minutes here. But this is pretty much what I wanted to focus on for the entire video. And the reason why I think this is important, whether you are a player, whether you are a designer, whether you develop games, whether you write about games or talk about games, or enjoy them in any capacity, I feel like you have to acknowledge the existence of these various categories in order to just about say anything meaningful. I mean, games are so complex. And I don't know, it just seems so much more logical, so much easier to understand that we absorb this media via a series of strung together pieces instead of the whole sort of abstract thing as all at once. So, the acknowledgement of these underlying parts, these pieces, and potentially how they work together is super important. I just kind of want to go over the wheel. Let's go over it right now. I'll show you a few pieces. This particular web-based demo has interactive pieces, so you can hover over individual sections and get definitions, which I think is super convenient. But yeah, in general, I talk a lot about gameplay elements, and these are things that actually affect the gameplay. And when we define gameplay, we talk about the actual challenges that are happening in a game, the actual interactive obstacles, the actual situations that have goals, some kind of goal, and players strive to complete that goal in some capacity. So that's pretty much narrowing it down to the things that you do in games to win. And this excludes settings in your menu. This excludes sound design half the time, or like all the time. It excludes sound design. It excludes, most of the time, excludes story elements. And there's a lot of crisscrossing in these categories, but it's really important to understand that they start off pretty separate, pretty individual before we even consider how they mix. We have gameplay elements. We have mechanics, player actions. These are the building blocks of how you interact with the game. And if games weren't interactive, then we wouldn't even be having this conversation. I wouldn't be playing games, and I'd be off somewhere else doing something. But the interactivity of the player is super important. Keep that in mind. Keeping that into focus, and how everything else that happens in the game that's meaningful pretty much spawns off of or is a direct result of player interactivity. So having a very specific category for that's super important. Yeah, we could break down mechanics even further. You have your input, because how can you be interactive if you don't have a controller? You got to input it somehow. And then we talk about control schemes, which is like a little subsection compared to input. When you're talking about inputs, you can talk about different controller devices and input actions, like the physical act of manipulating game controllers. And it drills down further and further. You have things like holding a button, or just the concept of hold. You have sliding, pinching, swiping for a touchscreen base, and it just goes further and further. Even things like commands, where you're inputting a fireball in Street Fighter, being able to have a word for that to differentiate it between other types of inputs, super important. People complain about this stuff all the time, or they comment on it, like, this move's too hard to use, this move's too easy, I don't want to hold the button for this long. So all of these should be common concepts, common words that you use to talk about games already, but it's super important to have that sort of on the tip of your tongue to keep it organized, and to be able to use these words to very accurately talk about games in the way that expresses how you feel about them. As you can see, all these topics drill down pretty deeply. I'll just go over the major ones. You got level elements, which are essentially the non-threatening building blocks of any kind of gameplay challenge. So, a lot of times we think about Mario when we're talking about, video games, platformers, level designs, things like that. So, the actual brick that they use to build the levels is just a really easy way to visualize what a level element is, but it includes things like bricks and walls and invisible ceilings and all of that. Just the physical sort of boundaries that you build your game out of. And some games don't even have level elements. You're talking about like word games that you can play out loud with your friends. and things like that. So not every game needs to have every single element in this chart, but this chart is super helpful for organizing when a game does, and that's just all there is to it. It's not even that complicated. You can drill down level elements into themes, so like you find in common games. You can define some of these things by their general attributes, like if a platform moves, if it's movable, can you move it with your main character or whatever. Just various things like that. And we talk about a broader category, which is this light blue color. Systems and rules. These are the things that can add extra definition to level elements, to mechanics, or anything else. But in general, games are filled with tons of systems and rules, and these things have various properties. They have various actions that can be associated with it. They can define things like contact and collision when you're talking about hit boxes and hurt boxes and startup frames and all of that. How characters and objects are defined in space, how they move, that's all super important. Common little verbs that you might find in games. These things kind of help you give language to that and understand how they relate to the rest of the game system. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of options here. You can see a few of them here. Common verbs that you see in many different games, including time control, and all these sub-actions. There's things like dynamics. I talk about dynamics all the time in design over time, but dynamics are the rules that link, connect, affect multiple game elements simultaneously. And since everything underneath this large blue circle are gameplay elements, you just have to think about the rules that connect them, and that's what creates a more dynamic game. And once you realize that dynamics are these rules that link all these pieces together, you have a really easy access to describing on a very simple way all these crazy things that happens in games. So dynamics super important. It's not even that complicated of a concept, but it gets complicated when you're talking about complicated games. So I think it's really important to see some of these definitions and to understand that each one of these concepts are separate, and then they combine in crazy ways. In a very common dynamic space, a lot of games, I think 98%, 99% of all games deal with some kind of 2D, 3D, 1D space or whatever. Very few games are just non-spatial, like word games or certain riddles or whatever, and most games aren't like that. Most games, give you some kind of an avatar, some kind of space, some kind of world to move in, so on and so forth. So you can talk about goals, and you can talk about all these other things in games. So yeah, even everything under this blue banner can have a lot of overlap, and a lot of these elements can sort of phase back and forth between categories. We have power-ups, upgrades, economies, weapons, upgrade systems, pickups, coins, power-ups, all that kind of fits under here. There's different words to describe different systems that people use, but essentially power-ups are an upgrade. They're a layer that you put on top of your gameplay in order to sort of develop it over time. So that's essentially what upgrade systems are. People can pretty easily recognize when you're talking about an upgrade system, a power-up, or whatever. That's not too complicated. An enemy design, whether you're talking about bosses or their AI or whatever, they got their own terms. That's why they're red. But yeah, that pretty much comprises all of the gameplay parts. Then there's all these other higher level concepts. Like everything under this light blue banner, the gameplay elements, you can see in a game, you can count it. They usually come with their own name. Enemies have their own names, weapons have their own names. Pretty easy to both understand and share what's going on with that. But everything beyond this blue circle gets pretty complicated. And you're talking about, modes and features, all the different gameplay types and challenges that a game can feature. We all understand what modes and features are. Whether your game supports X controller support or whatever, it's, features, not that complicated. You're talking about level design, that is complicated. Level design takes the arrangement of level elements and player, takes into account player mechanics and enemies and power-ups, and this is the actual thing that you play in the game that takes advantage of all these pieces. So level design is on a higher level than everything under this light blue banner. There's so many different things that you can do with level design. Level design is actually where the gameplay happens. So whether or not it's a puzzle-based game, an action-based game, whether or not it's hard or easy, whether it's co-op, whether it has a well-tuned difficulty curve or whatever, all that happens via the arrangement of all of the underlying gameplay elements. So for better or for worse, games are made or broken on their level design. A lot of games, most games. So it's something that's worthy of all these subcategories. It's something that takes a long time to wrap your head around, and each of these are a higher concept, and it's something that sort of over and above each individual piece that makes it up, because it's like this new beast. It's this new consideration. It's how the pieces work together and not necessarily greatly affected by how each individual piece is designed. Never underestimate the fact that from the base level, everything beyond the ring is like another tier of complexity. You know, feedback. I talked a little bit about feedback in the last video. We're talking about Assault Android Cactus, but it's just basically how the game communicates its information to you. You got visual, audio, tactile feedback. All this is super important. People talk about skill all the time in games, so I give you this really detailed breakdown of all these various types of skills so you can really identify how the game is testing you and if it's fair or not. You really have to have an understanding of all this to make those kinds of analysis, to even figure out if you know, what you should be doing to improve in a game, or how you should even design it in the first place. It's really important to have a strong understanding of all of that. We talk about story all the time in life, but in games as well. Lots of games have story, so having some kind of system to break it down into its content, its execution, and discourse, and break that down further into characters, plot, content, theme, setting, and then break down characters even further, and then keep going down, drilling down, to be able to talk about a story and its parts. I mean, it's about as complicated as game design. You know, the amount of complexity and the amount of skill you need to talk about stories effectively makes talking about games a whole lot harder. It brings it on a whole nother level, because story and gameplay are two very different things, and even discussing how they merge and how they help or hurt each other requires a really good understanding of just about everything on this wheel. And the final category is design space. We talk about design space all the time, and even though it looks small, it's a very huge thing. Design space is when you're considering how all the pieces of a game that fits underneath it, which is pretty much everything on this wheel, besides like modes and features, how it all fits together. We talk about balance a lot of times when we're talking about design space. We talk about variation. We talk about how the pieces are unique from each other. We talk about counters and interplay loops and all of that. So design space is a lot of times a high level consideration like level design that people kind of jump right into without necessarily understanding all the parts underneath. But yeah, this has been a long developed project of ours. I started developing this on Critical Gaming, so it's been, you know, over 8 years now, just slowly working up the language and understanding to even think like this, let alone make a nice little colorful graphic. But this entire color coding system is what we use for design oriented, and as you can see with our DO search and typing in design oriented, all of our posts on the design oriented blog are color coded to reflect some kind of design category. You can see here the light yellow is level design, this right here, the orange, is level elements, systems and rules. You can see design space, these dark purples that pop up. You can see feedback here, because we talked about Vlambeer. Yeah, you can see the little labels if you can read that. Yeah, like talking about these categories, finding something very specific about a game, finding out what is it about whatever's happening that makes you happy, sad, you know, pissed off, what you enjoy, what you're confused about. That's what having this language helps you do. And it actually helps you form and understand your own opinions instead of just being like a feeling monster, and you're just like a slave to your feelings, and everything is just either good or bad, and that's all there is to it. You can actually talk about things and share experiences and learn about new things when people articulate themselves well and correctly. It's just really cool. I think it's cool. I think it's helpful. You don't have to memorize the colors, but recognizing that there are different categories will take your thoughts, the way you play games, the way you talk about games, to a whole nother level. So that's just something I really want to encourage you guys about. I just wanted to drive home this idea that video games are complicated, and the reason why they're complicated is because people are putting a lot of heart, a lot of effort, a lot of ideas into it. There's a lot of parts to video games, so understanding those parts is how you access those ideas. Like, people put so many fine details into these things. People have so much hope for communicating with their players that understanding these parts really helps you access that information, those experiences better. So it doesn't matter if you're just a player, if you're a developer, if you're just a critic, even though I don't know how you can be just a critic. We're all players, right? But this is super helpful. The pitfalls that you encounter because you don't have a good structure, because you don't understand the parts and how they connect, and you're just trying to cram all of this complexity in your head without taking notes, without drawing diagrams. I don't know how you could do that. It's just why so many people fail with games criticism when they're either trying to write an essay or just talk with their friends half the time. It's why talking about games is so hard, because games are complex, and this is why it's complex. So that has been today's episode of Design Over Time. You can subscribe to us down below on YouTube. We make these videos every day, every weekday, so you get 5 a week. Let me know if you have any questions or comments, and leave those down in the comments below, or find us on Twitter at Design Oriented, or you can follow me at Kirby Kid. Yeah, more level design, more game critique, more stuff coming. I did a pretty interesting podcast with a friend over the weekend, talking somewhat about this stuff, the nature of games criticism, the value of it, and it links to some other interesting things. So you'll be hearing more about that in the future, but I want to get this video out of the way early so that you can kind of understand what the wheel is, what the colors are, and where I'm coming from. Until tomorrow, I will see you guys next time on the next episode of Design Over Time. Peace.